Chapter 25. Disclosure of the Ku'ula's hiding place. Mr. Johnson pondered this question in his mind while he was working and at night through the wee hours of the morning. From all indications, he knew Mr. Keema had the answer. He offered him money, but Mr. Keema shied away from him. Mr. Johnson figured that there must be some way he could induce him to accept money from him, and in return, just tell him where the Ku'ula rock was hidden. In this case, Mr. Keema didn't have to get the Ku'ula, but just say where it was hidden. There would be nothing wrong with that, he thought. What worried Mr. Keema was that he was told by the keeper of the Ku'ula rock what whoever tried to steal or divulge the place of the Ku'ula would risk the penalty of death to him or to his loved ones. This is what bothered Mr. Keema all his life. The keeper had died, and he took the secret of the Ku'ula rock with him. Since Hawaii had become a territorial government, all the Ku'ula rock ceremonies had ceased. He began to recollect the early part of his life. He used to hang around with the keeper of the Ku'ula. He learned how to surround the school of fish with the nets. Then he used a small net to scoop the ahole and put them in the bamboo baskets. When the baskets were filled, the keeper picked up his Ku'ula from the altar and returned home. Then Mr. Keema pulled up all the nets and stretched them out on high ground to dry. The next day, he would go over the nets and patch them when torn. As soon as the nets were dry, he rolled them up and took them to a nearby hut and left them with the owner of the nets. For all this work, he had his share of fish that he had taken home to Waiohinu. He had a horse that he rode back and forth. He enjoyed the luau given for the royal party and later for the villagers who helped to make the party a success. Mr. Johnson began to plan how he would get Mr. Keema to divulge the place where the Ku'ula was hidden. He said, "I will treat him to a beer party. I will invite 2 of my friends and let them know what I want them to do. We will try to encourage him to tell us where the Ku'ula rock is. If he refuses to answer, then we will use the last tactics by claiming that the Ku'ula rock is a hoax to deceive people. I believe this will get my answer. The best time, I think, is on a Saturday evening when I can have Domingo take the family to the evening show. I can then be alone with Mr. Keema and my friends at the Shimizu beer parlor." The next day, Mr. Johnson came to Naalehu alone and brought some red fish called u'u to Mr. Shimizu. He made reservations to have fried fish for 2, then walked next door and found Mr. Kupahu at home. He asked him to have lunch, and Mr. Kupahu agreed. Mr. Johnson's main idea was to ask Mr. Kupahu about this Ku'ula rock and thought he probably could give him an inkling about where it was hidden. Just then, his 2 friends walked in, and Mr. Johnson called them over to the table. He asked them to come to his beer party on Saturday evening. They both accepted and left. While Mr. Kupahu and Mr. Johnson were enjoying their lunch, Mr. Johnson spoke to Mr. Kupahu about the Ku'ula o Makale. Mr. Kupahu admitted that he knew about it very well. He said, "When I was a young man, I usually attended the royal party luau, and after it was over, the people of the village took it upon themselves and celebrated. I helped bring the fish from Kalai. I have seen the Ku'ula on the altar near the edge of the seashore and the ahole surrounding it. There, I saw Mr. Keema scooping the fish and filling the bamboo baskets. I helped carry those baskets and load them on the donkeys. The party was held in the village of Makale, just a mile from Kalai. I have known the keeper of the Ku'ula. He was the only one to guard it." All the people of Makale and surrounding villages participated in the celebration. It was a big event with all kinds of sports. All the kahunas came and demonstrated their skills. They even tried to steal the Ku'ula. That is the reason the keeper guarded it with his life, and he was also a kahuna. Mr. Keema was only a helper. The keeper had no family and lived the life of a lonely man, although he was known to cure those who came to him for help. Some of the people feared him because they claimed he outfought anyone who dared to lay claim to his ku'ula. I visited him at his home, and he was a kind man from what I observed, and also a wise man. I asked him a lot of things, especially about the ku'ula, and also what would happen if someone would steal it. The keeper replied, "Whoever steals or tries to steal it, the penalty is death to the culprit or to his loved ones. I will always get my ku'ula back." I had several kahunas try to use mental telepathy through a trance, only they met me instead of the ku'ula. Knowing that their power cannot overtake me, they at once leave me alone. This is when I found out that the ku'ula o Makale is from outer space. This rock is a meteorite and fell on the slope of Mauna Loa. His grandparents hiked for 3 days to the mountain to pick this meteorite. When they arrived, the fire that burned the forest had subsided, but the meteorite was still burning. He waited a week before he picked a piece of the meteorite. He got an ordinary rock and used it as a hammer to break off a piece. His grandparents knew this meteorite had the magnetic power to attract certain fish. This power of the meteorite and the power he held to communicate through mental telepathy made him the strongest on this side of the island. This is why he was picked to serve the royal party. When the island became a territory, there were no more luau's to serve the royal party. The last I heard was that the keeper of the ku'ula had died and the ku'ula was buried with him. He knew there were many kahunas who wanted to get that ku'ula because the fish were still out there in the ocean. I think you have seen that yourself. Even the best of the kahunas up to the present time cannot locate the ku'ula. Even Mr. Keema doesn't know where it is buried. If this was an ordinary ku'ula rock and a human soul was inserted, it would not get the fish in a school as does the meteorite rock. Any human can locate the ordinary ku'ula. A meteorite ku'ula has no human soul inserted and becomes useless by itself. The keeper is the only key to get that rock. If the keeper wants you to have the ku'ula, he will direct you to get it. I tell you, this is not worth your while just because of those fish out in the ocean. The penalty is heavy. The best thing is to forget. Keema has forgotten, and so have I. Mr. Johnson listened, but did not have much to say. By that time, Mr. Kupahu had finished his lunch. Mr. Johnson asked him to have a glass of beer, but Mr. Kupahu said he didn't drink, thanked him for the lunch, and said he would have to leave. Mr. Johnson sat alone for a while and began to think. In his mind, he remembered all that Mr. Kupahu told him, but he still insisted that there would be no harm if he got the rock. Even Mr. Kupahu had said that the rock was buried when the keeper died. If the rock had been buried with him, someone would have taken it by now. He thought, if Mr. Keema will tell me just where the keeper took the ku'ula after they were through fishing, he must have seen where it was put away, because Keema was always with him. When he wanted Keema, he was always there. Mr. Kupahu's words made Mr. Johnson more determined to get the rock. He said to himself, I will make an attempt according to my plan, and I think I can find the answer. He stopped by Mr. Keema's house and said, I'm going to celebrate this coming weekend at the Shimizu Beer Bar, and you are invited. The time is 7 in the evening. Please come and don't miss this get-together. Mr. Keema, not knowing what the intent was, accepted with full heart. Mr. Johnson never spoke to anyone about the plan, except to his 2 friends. The day came. In the morning, Mr. Johnson told his wife that they were going to the movie that night and she should ask Domingo to go. The wife agreed and was happy. Domingo accepted, and everything seemed to work out well for Mr. Johnson. After supper, they started for Naalehu to see the movies. On the way, Mr. Johnson told his wife he would stop at the beer bar with his two friends and would come to the show later. Domingo, Mrs. Johnson, and the little girl got off the pickup truck at the theater, and Mr. Johnson drove to the beer bar. As he entered, his two friends were waiting for him. Mr. Keema had not arrived because it was too early. In the meantime, Mr. Johnson talked to his friends about Keema's not telling him where the ku'ula was hidden. He said, "This time I'm going to reverse asking. I will denounce his ku'ula as a hoax. This time he will prove to me that the ku'ula will bring the fish. You two must help me." Then Mr. Keema came in, smiling, and Mr. Johnson said, "I am glad you came to celebrate my party." Mr. Keema did not say a word, but sat down and waited for his glass of beer. They all talked about different subjects. The subject of the ku'ula was not mentioned until Mr. Johnson saw that Mr. Keema was feeling high. Then he said that the story about the fish he helped fill the bamboo basket with was a hoax. His two friends mentioned the same thing. Still, Mr. Keema claimed it was the truth. They said, "There is nobody here to acknowledge you're speaking the truth." This made Mr. Keema mad, and he spoke up. "I saw the ku'ula rock placed on the altar and the fish come in schools, and when the keeper took the ku'ula away, the fish left and returned to the deep ocean. I saw him take the ku'ula to the burial cave at Makale." Mr. Keema was talking, not knowing he was divulging the hiding place of the ku'ula. This is what Mr. Johnson wanted him to tell. He said to Mr. Keema, "You sure fought hard to tell us you were right. I believe you now. You are telling us the truth." Mr. Keema did not say a word because he was drunk from the beer. Mr. Johnson asked his friends to take Mr. Keema and put him in the back of the pickup truck and lay him down. He said, "I will take him home. By that time, he will be sober." The men then thanked him and left. Mr. Johnson said to himself, "This evening was profitable to me. I now rest at ease and am pleased that I am going to get the ku'ula at the burial cave. I am sure I know where the cave is, but where the ku'ula lies hidden is something else. Time will tell." He walked out and looked at Mr. Keema to see if he was comfortable, then drove the pickup truck to the theater and waited for the family. They all drove to the coffee shop to have coffee and cake. Mr. Keema was fast asleep in the back of the truck. After they were through, they drove the pickup truck to Mr. Keema's house. As they were nearing his home, Domingo tried to wake him up, but could not. When they arrived, Mr. Johnson helped Domingo carry Mr. Keema to his room and undressed him. His wife got a wet towel and patted his face. This woke Mr. Keema up, and he wondered where he was. He looked around and then turned over and went right back to sleep. On the way home from Mr. Keema's house, they had a flat tire and stopped to change it. Mrs. Johnson and the little girl decided to walk home because it was less than a mile's walk. They were home by the time Mr. Johnson and Domingo arrived. Mr. Johnson said that because it was so late, they would sleep in and work in the afternoon. Mrs. Johnson was up at noon to clean the house and do some washing. Mr. Johnson was at the lighthouse doing his work, checking the battery water, and later would start the gas engine to charge the battery. In his mind, he was laying his plan of how he would fetch the ku'ula without Mrs. Johnson suspecting it was the ku'ula. He did not want to worry his wife. On the other hand, Mr. Johnson thought nothing of the dangerous things that would happen to him. All he had in his mind was the ahole fish 3 miles out and the kind of money he was going to receive. This is what he dreamed of. As he pondered the situation, he said to himself, "Don't let that worry me. I will get that ku'ula. It is within my reach, and I cannot fail now."